we were driving to church, I wondered how many Sundays have I had in my life? How many? I've got another one today. So I sat down. I'm not sure about my math. It's been a long time since I had arithmetic at Chinkapin. But if I figured correctly, I've had about 4,500 Sundays in my 86 years. 45 Sundays. I was born gratefully to a young couple that went to church every Sunday. So I started going to church before I was born. In fact, I'm sure for 9 months I went to church before I was born. And I was trying to think this morning how many Sundays I can remember in these 86 years in which I did not go to church. It's amazing how few 6 Sundays I've had. Maybe 1 or 2, maybe half a dozen across the years, but not that many. I did take off a Sunday or 2 back in 2000 when I first began to have some heart issues and got a couple of stents, and we took off I think a month. I remember one time when we were in Europe, we were in Switzerland, and we couldn't find a church where we could worship on Sunday. But there have not been many. And I'm grateful. I taught one morning this week, Psalm 122, where the psalmist wrote, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Aren't you glad? I don't know how many more years, many Sundays I'll have, but God willing, I hope every one of them will allow me to be in church somewhere. Amen? Don and Steve, where did Steve go? He got a buddy here. Is he upstairs? Oh, he's in the back of the church. We're glad to have these men here. Don and I show up at the same funeral every once in a while because we have a lot of mutual friends, and they've all gotten older and they're dying on us. It's good to see you, Don. I've got an outline in your bulletin. Don't look at it. Save that one for next Sunday. About 3:30 in the morning on Friday morning, I went to bed thinking I was going to preach that outline on Thursday night. But about 3:30 in the morning, I had one of those periods in the middle of the night that I couldn't sleep. And suddenly there came into my heart with a spiritual force a message I preached to you in November 2018. And the Lord said to me, they need to hear that again. So this morning, I'm going to go back to 2018, November 2018. I'm sure all of you will remember exactly what I preached that time. In fact, I remember it so well, I didn't remember that I preached it here. So I went back to check, and sure enough, I did. The text is a strange text. You remember the text. If you were here that day, you will remember this text. It's Song of Solomon, chapter 2, and verse 15. Now, let me read it and see if that doesn't refresh your memory. Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 15. Catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines. For our vines have tender grapes. were about the little foxes? Probably not. Song of Solomon's an interesting book. There's no other book in the Bible like the Song of Solomon. The name gives a hint about it. It's a song. It's written like a song, poetically. And it's a poetic description of the love relationship between a man and a woman. Probably, in this case, Solomon and a young Shulamite with whom Solomon had fallen in love. And he recounts in that song about that relationship with this young woman who became his wife. Well, interpreters of the song, through the years, some of them have said it's really to be taken just as a poetic record about this love relationship between a man and a woman. And for you guys who've forgotten, tomorrow is Valentine's Day. I'm not preaching this to remind you of that, but it is tomorrow. And I listened to a man speak this week on YouTube who's done a study over 150 times across the country in which he interprets the Song of Solomon for its practical application to the relationship of a man and a woman. But the first book I ever read on Song of Solomon impressed me, so I've never forgotten. Dr. Harry Ironside, who was the pastor of the Moody Church in Chicago, one of the most famous churches in America, did a study through the Song of Solomon in which he interpreted the song allegorically. By that, I mean the things in the song are not to be taken literally, but they be taken as representing something. And what you see in the song through the eyes of Dr. Ironside is a description of the love relationship between God and Israel, or between Christ and his church, between Christ and you, if you're a Christian. And in the verse that I read, in this allegory, the vineyard represents that relationship. A vineyard is a very important thing in Middle Eastern life because grapes and wine are a part of their lifestyle. And it's a source of pleasure and joy to take the fruits of the vine and make wine from it in their culture. The relationship between God and his people, between you and Christ, is meant to be the source of much pleasure and much joy and much fulfillment in your life. But in that Middle Eastern culture, there were these little, well, he calls them foxes in the text. Actually, then he amends it and says, little foxes. They were actually more like what we would call a jackal, but they were a threat to any vineyard. They weren't very big, but they could slip into a vineyard, particularly in springtime when the vines were beginning to burst out, and they could get into that vineyard, and they would, because they'd been through a hard winter, they'd eat those buds that were coming out on the vine. And when June and July came and it was time to gather grapes, there was no grapes because the little foxes ate them. And in hard winters, they would even burrow down and eat the root structure out from under a vine. And when spring came, dead. And the lesson from this verse, and what Solomon is suggesting, is this: that in our relationship with God, since we're His people, or your relationship to your marriage partner, it's not necessarily big things that destroy or hinder your relationship, but often it's little things you don't even think about. And if they're not stopped, if they're not caught, if they're not taken out of your life with God or your marriage become meaningless and empty. I just want to identify for you this morning 4 little boxes. You find them in your own heart, and because they're tolerated in your own heart, they're affecting the depth and the meaning and the joy of your relationship with the Lord, or your relationship with your marriage partner. What are they? The first one is selfishness. There's another word for that: pride. You know that word. Pride is the product of selfishness. Actually, it's a part of the human condition. You were born in this world with an inclination to make self number one. You were, I was. All of my children and grandchildren have been born that way, with an inclination to make themselves the center of the whole universe. To replace God with self. Make self number one. I remember reading about a woman. Her name was Edith. It was said of Edith that to know Edith, well, to the north and the south and the east and the west, life was all about Edith. She was going to talk about herself more than you wanted to hear her talk about herself. All of her decisions would be in her best interest. It was all about Edith. All of us have known Edith. In fact, sometimes we might have been Edith. When I was just a teenager, I learned an acrostic that I still have in my memory. Joy. J-O-Y. Jesus first, others second, yourself third, and that will bring joy. Amen? Do you remember that? Any of you old enough to remember that acrostic? See, when you put yourself first, others second, on down, it doesn't work. It's when you put Christ first. You cannot serve 2 masters. You can only serve one. Self, that's the first one. Second, deceitfulness. There's another word for that. Hypocrisy. Do you understand the word hypocrisy? A hypocrite is somebody who's pretending to be something that they're not. They're not always aware of it. But they're putting on a face that's not their face. They're acting in ways that are not consistent with what they are in their hearts. In Matthew's Gospel, you got your Bible, chapter 15 in Matthew's Gospel, verses 8 and 9. Actually, it's Jesus quoting from the prophet Isaiah, Matthew chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. Let me read them for you if I can find them here. Here they are. These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips. They like to talk about how much they love God, love His church, love His people. But their heart is far from me. What they say with their lips is not consistent with what's in their heart. And in vain, I mean, it has no meaning. In vain, they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. It's all man-made. It's not genuine. Deceitfulness. Now, when the Lord woke me up in the morning and began to review with me what I'd said about this text in other days, it suddenly dawned on me, this is probably the little box that I find in my heart most often. And just we want people to think the best of us. It's so easy for us to hide in our heart somewhere an unforgiven sin, a sinful deed, a sinful word, a sinful thing, and we keep it hidden from our husband, hidden from our wife, hidden in church. We put a smile on our face and we sing, "Oh, how I love Jesus." And down deep in our hearts, we ever need to have a conversation with Him all week. With our lips, we do serve Him. We practice fake living, not real living in our walk with God. And be careful. That's a little fox that'll eat the very fruit off of the limbs and leave your Christian life without joy and victory. There's a third one. The third one is bitterness. Bitterness. Little fox. Do you understand bitterness? Let me give you an explanation of bitterness. Bitterness is unresolved anger. Somebody hurt you. Somebody offended you. Somebody disappointed you. But instead of extending grace and forgiveness to that person who harmed you, hurt you, wounded you, you allowed that to lay in your heart unattended, and it gets deeper into your spirit, and after a while, it's become bitterness. Hebrews talks about a root of bitterness. It has all kinds of bad fruit. Bitterness. It affects your relationships with others. It affects your relationship with God. Bitterness. Anger that you've not done anything about, that you've not corrected, that you've not addressed. The Bible warns us, be angry and sin not. Anytime there's anger, there's always the possibility of sin. Bitterness. A friend of mine years past wrote a book, and in that book he included this story, a true story, about two brothers, twin brothers who lived up in the Midwest, small town, and together they operated a family store, general kind of store. And they went to the same church, they had everything in common, they shared life together. And then one day, something happened, unexpectedly, that changed everything. One of the men was waiting on a customer at the desk, and the transaction involved a $1 bill. And he received the dollar from the gentleman who bought something, laid it on the desk, and meant when he came back to put it in the cash drawer. Well, he went off to do something else and forgot about it. Then he came back and he looked for the dollar and it wasn't there. So he said to his brother, his business partner, "What did you do with the dollar that I left here?" His brother said to him, "I didn't see any dollar. I don't know anything about a dollar." Well, they got in a discussion about that. The man was absolutely sure, "I left the dollar right here by the cash register, and now it's gone." So the only other person in this room is my brother. So he must have done something. But the other brother said, "I didn't see it. I didn't touch it. I didn't have anything to do with it." That thing festered. It broke their relationship with each other. They became so angry about it that they had actually broke up their business partnership. They built a wall right down through the middle of their store, and one had a store on one side, the other had a store on the other side. That went on for years. They went to the same church, but they didn't sit on the same side because they didn't have any more family get-togethers. Anger and bitterness was in their hearts. And then one day, 17 years later, something happened. A stranger drove up, parked outside, got out of his car, and came into the door on the left, which went into the store of the first brother. And he said to the man, when he came in, "Sir, have you been in business here a long time?" He said, "Yeah, almost all my life." He said, "I've come to ask you to forgive me and to repay a debt." The man said to him, "What do you mean, me forgive you? I've never seen you before. What kind of debt are you talking about?" He said, 17 years ago, I was going through your city, your town, as a hobo on a train. And out at the edge of town, the train stopped and I got off. I was hungry and I came down this alley behind your store looking for some place that I might find something to eat. And I looked in the back door and I saw the cash register, and I saw a dollar laying beside it. And I slipped in that back door, and I took that dollar and slipped out, went down the street, and bought me something to eat. He said, recently I became Christian. And I remembered that I'd stolen that dollar. So I've come to ask you to forgive me and ask you to receive repayment for that dollar. The man looked at him in utter unbelief. He said, "Come with me." Took him next door to his brother's place and said, "Would you tell my brother that story?" And they did, repeated the story. Those two brothers stood there looking at each other. They'd had a falling out. They'd had a broken relationship for 17 years over something that never happened. Now, I know the thing you're bitter about probably did happen. But I doubt it was nearly as bad as you've imagined in your mind since then. Because our sinful mind has a way of justifying self and exaggerating things that others have done to us. And I doubt that it was all their fault and none your fault. It's a little fox. First Baptist Church won't turn you out of the church for bitterness. It bring emptiness into your heart and make your life miserable and fruitless. It's a little fox. Let's catch it. That's what the bride said to the bridegroom. Let's catch it. That should destroy the joy of our relationship. Well, there's one other. The little fox of neglect or thoughtlessness. There's not taking the relationship seriously. This can be true of a marriage. It can be true of your walk with God. If we neglect so great a salvation, how shall we escape? The book of Hebrews asks. Neglect is it's murderous. You neglect your health, and you'll end up in the hospital. You neglect your marriage, and you end up in divorce court. You neglect your business, and you're out of business. You neglect your farm, and you'll be a truck driver. You'll be doing something else. Neglect. You neglect your relationship with your wife, your husband. Become preoccupied with lesser things. And the joy of marriage and love will be lost. You neglect your walk and your relationship with the Lord. And the first thing you know, the joy and the excitement's gone. I read this story, true story. Dr. C. Roy Angel was the pastor of the Central Baptist Church in Miami for a generation. He put a number of his sermons into books, and I've read some of them. And Dr. Gordon Grimes, in a book of his own commitment, retold this story that I'd read earlier and reviewed it in my memory. Dr. Angel was in a church somewhere up the East Coast in a revival. And on Sunday morning, in his sermon, he used a story that most preachers have used sometime in their ministry. It was about Thomas Carlyle, a famous Englishman, a man of literature, renowned across the English-speaking world in his day. He was so preoccupied with his career that he never got around to getting married until he was up in his 40s. And he finally married his secretary, a woman that was very devoted to him, very faithful. He just did so busy. He hadn't even noticed her, but one day he noticed her, and they were married. And sometime after they were married, she came down with cancer. Fatal case of cancer. She had long sickness. In the home, she had a room where he prepared for her. And she lay there sick across those years, finally died. And on the day he buried her, on a damp English day, he came back to the house and went into the room where his wife had laid as a patient across the months and years. And did something that he wouldn't have done while she was alive. He reached over and took her diary, her journal, from the bedside and opened it up and began to read it. There were entries like this, a few. She would write, "He came by this morning, stood by my bed for a few minutes, held my hand. I felt like I was in heaven." A few like that. But most days she put something like this. "I waited all day. I hoped he would come. He never came. Entry after entry after entry documenting his neglect of his wife when she really needed him. It shattered him. The man got in his carriage and went back to the cemetery on that cold, damp evening. Got down on his knees beside the fresh grave. Looked up toward heaven, and from the depth of his being he cried, "Oh, I never knew! I never knew! I never knew!" But it was too late. The opportunity's gone. Neglect had taken it away. Dr. Angel told that story in Sunday morning sermon. The lady seated about halfway back in the sanctuary with two little boys seated beside her. When he finished, she didn't move. People were leaving. She still was there. And she was weeping. So Dr. Angel left the pulpit, went back and stand in front of her and said, "Ma'am, I see you're weeping. Is there something I can do for you?" She said, "Yes, sir, you can." She said, "Would you put that story about Thomas Carlyle in your sermon tonight and tell it again?" He said, "Ma'am, why should I do that?" She said, "Well, my husband owns a pharmacy. He's so busy. He's like Thomas Carlyle. The children get up after he's gone to work, and by the time he's home in the evening, I've already put him to bed. He has no time for us. And he's promised that he'll come to the service tonight. I think if you tell that story, it'd help him." And so he was hesitant. He said, "Well, my thought was, if I tell the story tonight, they'll think I'm senile. And I can't remember from evening to morning to evening what I've said in the morning." And I can appreciate that. But he promised the lady he'd do it. And that night, sure enough, service began. He looked back there. There sat the lady, the two boys, and by her, a well-dressed businessman. And he included the story again in his sermon. And after the service was finished, he looked, and the family was still sitting there. But now it was the man that was weeping, not the woman. He left his pew, left his place on the platform, went back to him and said, "Sir, can I help you?" He said, "No, Dr. Angel, you already have." He said, "I'm that man. And I've asked God to forgive me. And I'm going to make changes in my life. I'm going to be there for my wife and my boys." The angel said, "Every Christmas after that, I got a box of candy from that man." Got a box of candy for him. Neglect. It's devastating to a marriage. It's devastating to a Christian walk. The Lord likes to hear you say, at least once a day, "Lord, I love you. You love me." He likes to hear your voice. He likes it when you draw near and you spend some moments with him. That's the reason Solomon put it in. He knew, his bride to-be did. She knew that if our relationship is going to flower out and really become what God meant it to be, we've got to catch those little foxes, those little things, like selfishness, like deceitfulness, like bitterness, like neglect. And we've got to put first things first. Christ first. My relationship with my wife first. We've got to rearrange life and get those little foxes. If you catch one, I don't care what PETA says, kill it. Kill it. Nail the hide to the wall. Amen? Amen. Kill it. Get rid of it. Get out of your heart anything that's going to keep you from drawing close to God or close to your marriage partner and making the most of the relationships that God's given to you. So there we are, little foxes. I'll make you wait a week or so to what I want to say about the men who will wear a crown, probably. But this morning, I'm more concerned about who would catch the little foxes. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank